We also have a word, cooperativity, okay? Or a cooperative system. This is one that exhibits an ultrasensitive response when multiple ligands are binding to the same receptor or protein. Okay? You can have positive cooperativity. So the first ligand binds, and it increases the affinity for the next ligand to bind and the next ligand to bind. Okay? It's sort of, it makes, once the first one binds, which is sort of maybe the biggest hurdle, it's easier and easier for the next ones to bind. They bind with stronger and higher affinity. An example is hemoglobin. It exhibits positive cooperativity. Negative is just the reverse. When the first ligand binds, it'll prevent other ligands from binding or lower the affinity for the additional binding sites. Okay, so in this figure from your book, we have our linear or graded output in A. We have one input ligand binding to our protein. Monomeric proteins with a single binding site can't exhibit cooperativity. Okay? They only bind one thing, so cooperative. This is not a system that could be described as cooperative. Okay? In situation B, we have cooperativity achieved through a conformational change, which is an example of allostery or allosterics. So when the first ligand binds, it changes the shape of the binding site to make it even more round to receive this circle. And these increased arrows, these sort of bigger arrows, are just meant to sort of show you a relative, like it's easier, it's faster, it wants to proceed towards the binding of the second one. In C, we have cooperative binding without allostery. Okay? So a transcription factor binds to DNA sort of weakly, but the second binding of some sort of other protein coming in and binding is enhanced. It's even stronger binding of this sort of secondary transcription factor. Or, I mean, most of these transcription units are really complex, bunch of proteins having to come together. Why isn't C allostery? What was the definition of allostery? Yes. Single protein. Two or more sites, one protein. Okay? These are subunits, but this protein is all one connected. It has two different sites in a single protein. These are two separate proteins coming together. So they're cooperating, but we don't have two binding sites on the same protein. They each have a single binding site for some adjacent parts of DNA. Okay? So with positive cooperativity, I have a protein with two distinct binding sites. When ligand A binds alone, it would have some affinity KD1. However, imagine that you have a separate ligand, ligand B, that when it binds, it changes the shape of the binding site for A, making it even stronger, right? It's positive cooperativity. It's making the affinity higher affinity, stronger binding. Like I said, a way to think of it is once B binds, it makes it easier and more accessible for A to bind. So KD1 for this situation here, where we are just showing the ligand binding without the cooperativity of ligand B, is going to be higher than the dissociation for this. The reason it's higher is because high affinity is low KD. Okay? So KD in the second case is smaller because we've improved the affinity. We had this positive cooperativity. Binding of B is shown as sort of opening up the binding site, increasing the strength, raising affinity, lowering KD. And negative cooperativity is going to be the reverse situation. Okay? The binding of B can be looked at as sort of closing up the binding site, making it more difficult or less likely for ligand A to bind. Okay? And then in this case, the sign is reversed here. Okay? The dissociation constant would be lower in the first case. You've now made it harder and weaker binding in the second case with your negative cooperativity, so KD would be higher. And I just, again, I stop and say, like, remember the relationship between the words high affinity and low KD and the way these signs go, because if you see some table full of KD values and you're looking at them go down and I'm saying, like, here's some brand new protein you've never seen binding some brand new ligand I've never mentioned, and I'm asking you if it has positive or negative cooperativity, there's really only one answer, and when you get it exactly backwards, you can't have any points. So again, keep straight, if you're just comparing KDs, are they going up or down as things continue to bind? Which one's which? Yeah. You could also have, on a single enzyme, allosteric feedback. Okay, so this sentence is kind of a mouthful. Some enzymes exhibit a feedback mechanism where they convert their substrate to a product that is then an activator. So it binds on an allosteric site on the enzyme itself, causing a conformational change that opens up its own active site to further speed up catalysis rate. So first of all, what is catalysis? If you have a reaction that you say gets catalyzed, so it goes faster. What does it do to a free energy curve? It lowers the activation energy, right? We saw something that looked like this, all right? And what do enzymes do? Enzymes are a type of catalyst, right? They catalyze reactions. Okay, so we saw free energy curves where we said there's some sort of initial energy input that needs to be there in order for reactant to turn into product, substrate turn into product, whatever it might be. So you can lower the activation energy with the use of an enzyme. Here's just a bunch of other drawings of that. Okay, so again, going from reactant to product, we'd have some normal activation energy. When an enzyme's involved, we don't eliminate it, but we lower it, so the speed of the reaction will increase. Same sort of thing here. You want to turn substrate to product. By itself, it would take a lot more energy, but if you use an enzyme to sort of facilitate this change, it lowers that activation energy and speeds things up. Okay. So what that looks like in a feedback loop on a single enzyme is it binds its substrate, it turns it into a product, the product binds in its own allosteric site, changes the shape for the initial substrate such that it can bind it and change it even faster. Okay? This is sort of a positive feedback loop. Okay? And you can have, this would be sort of the normal rate of output. If you just had enzyme binds your substrate, turns it to product, binds a new substrate, turns it to product. But with this sort of allosteric activation or sort of self-activation, you can get an ultra-sensitive output and even faster conversion of these things.